In today's stories, we follow the darkest missing person deaths ever recorded. From a sailor who watched an infection spread with his radio 6 feet away, to a photographer framing his shot when century-old boards snapped beneath him, sending him into darkness no one knew was there. It was October 12, 2016, in rural farmland outside Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The afternoon was overcast with temperatures at 48 degrees Fahrenheit and light rain that had been falling since morning. The ground was saturated from 3 days of intermittent showers. Visibility was reduced to about 200 yards in the mist and fog. Chandler Webb was 29 years old, an avid cyclist who rode long distances several times per week. He worked remotely and often took afternoon rides through the countryside on gravel roads winding between cornfields and pastures. He was in good physical condition and knew the area well. He left his apartment at 3:30 p.m. for what he told his roommate would be a quick 20-mile loop before dark. He wore a bright yellow rain jacket, helmet, and carried front and rear lights, his phone, ID, and a small repair kit. His roommate noted he was always punctual riding alone. He was expected back by 6 p.m. Recent heavy rains had left the gravel roads muddy and unstable. Around 4:45 p.m., Chandler was riding southbound on a remote stretch about 11 miles from his apartment when he approached a drainage crossing where a culvert opening sat partially hidden by tall grass. His bike tracks showed he had moved toward the edge, possibly to avoid a puddle. The shoulder gave way. He crashed through the vegetation into the culvert opening, tumbling approximately 8 feet into the concrete pipe. His helmet showed significant scraping and a crack along the left side. He landed in 6 inches of cold, fast-moving water at approximately 42 degrees Fahrenheit. His phone was knocked from his pocket during the fall, landing in the water with a cracked screen that no longer functioned. What happened next was reconstructed from physical evidence. Mud drag marks and hand impressions indicated he crawled forward rather than back toward the entrance, consistent with disorientation from the fall. At a junction 40 feet in, 3 identical pipe openings converged. Scrape marks along one pipe's lower edge showed he had entered it and continued forward. The pipe ran 160 feet, gradually descending to a grated outlet into a retention pond. The grate was bolted shut and showed fresh scratch marks along its frame. Near the grated end, evidence indicated he had attempted to reverse direction. The pipe measured 24 inches in diameter. Investigators determined that while trying to rotate, his body shifted diagonally with his shoulders and hips pressed against opposite sides of the curved walls, leaving him physically unable to reposition in either direction. Over the following hours, the cold water and confined space accelerated heat loss until his movement stopped entirely. By 7 p.m., his roommate grew concerned. A missing persons report was filed by 9 p.m. Searches over the following days covered his known routes repeatedly without result. His bike had come to rest below the road surface, hidden by tall grass and the eroded slope. Volunteers expanded the search across surrounding farmland and creek corridors. A week passed, then 11 days, with no trace of him. A volunteer searcher eventually noticed a faint reflection in roadside vegetation, the rear light still clipped to Chandler's bike. Responders followed the nearby culvert to the grated outlet where his body was found, requiring crews to cut through the pipe from above. The autopsy confirmed hypothermia as the cause of death, with core temperature having dropped to fatal levels over an estimated 6 to 8 hour window following the fall. Time of death was placed at late evening on October 12th, 11 days before he was found. The case was ruled accidental. Investigators noted the pipe diameter and post-fall disorientation had made self-rescue effectively impossible once he passed the junction chamber. The culvert was later fitted with warning signs and fencing, and the eroded shoulder was repaired. It was June 18, 2014, in the wetlands near the Atchafalaya Basin in Louisiana. The morning was already hot and humid, with temperatures near 84 degrees Fahrenheit and water levels high from recent spring rains. Merle Dixon was 41 years old, a recreational fisherman who who made day trips 2 hours from home to fish for bass and catfish in the shallow marsh channels. He had moderate experience in the area, but was not a regular visitor to this particular section of wetland. He was in good health and familiar with small boats in shallow water environment. He arrived at a public access point at 8:30 a.m., launching a small aluminum john boat with a 15 horsepower outboard motor. He carried standard fishing gear, a cooler, and his phone in a waterproof case. He told another fisherman at the launch he planned to explore channels on the eastern side and would be back by mid-afternoon before any storms arrived. The area was a maze of narrow channels and shallow flats covered with lily pads, cattails, and submerged vegetation. Water depth ranged from a few inches to about 4 feet over a bottom of soft mud and organic material. Around 11:30 a.m., roughly 2 miles from the launch, Merle stepped out of the boat wearing chest waders near a cluster of cypress stumps where the water appeared shallow enough to fish. The initial footing seemed solid. On his 4th or 5th step, his right foot punched through a crust of matted vegetation into decomposed organic matter beneath, sinking past the knee. He tried to pull free, but the suction held firm. Shifting his weight caused his left foot to break through as well. Both legs were buried to mid-thigh, locked in place. The boat drifted 15 feet away in a slight breeze, out of reach. He pulled out his phone and tried calling emergency services. The signal showed 1 bar, and calls failed to connect or dropped immediately. Over the next 30 to 45 minutes, he worked to free himself, rocking side to side and attempting to lift one leg at a time. Neither foot moved. His waders had filled with water, adding significant weight and increasing downward pressure on his legs. The surrounding water reached his upper thigh, making any leverage impossible. Repeated call attempts produced only brief connections, never long enough to communicate his location. The last call was logged at 2:33 p.m., after which the battery gave out. Over the following hours, exhaustion set in. He remained upright, but completely immobile, held from the waist down. The surrounding water, influenced by upstream runoff moving through the marsh channels, rose gradually through the afternoon. By late afternoon, it had reached his chest. He was still standing, still trapped, with no remaining strength to fight. As the water continued rising, he could no longer keep his face above the surface. The fisherman from the launch reported Merle missing around 6 p.m. His empty boat was found the following day, drifting 2.3 miles from the launch. Search crews spent 12 days navigating the dense terrain before locating his body on June 30th. Submerged approximately 60 feet from where the boat had drifted. Specialized equipment was required for recovery. Call logs confirmed 8 attempted emergency calls between 11:47 a.m. and 2:33 p.m., most failing to connect. The medical examiner ruled the death a drowning after Merle became trapped in the marsh sediment, his legs embedded deep in the decomposed bottom. Water depth at the site measured about 3.5 feet during recovery, consistent with fluctuating water level in the marsh channels. Investigators estimated he died 5 to 6 hours after becoming trapped. The access point was later marked with warning sign, and sections of the marsh were restricted due to unstable ground. It was November 8th, 2017, in the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas. A light wind blew from the northwest at 5 to 8 miles per hour. The moon was in its waning crescent phase, providing minimal light. Sunset had occurred at 5:12 p.m. Natalie Keller was 26 years old, a graduate student who enjoyed solo camping trips for solitude and to work on her research writing. She had camped alone several times before, though usually in warmer months. She had moderate outdoor experience and was in good health. She arrived at a dispersed camping area around 3 p.m., parking at a small pullout along a Forest Service road. The campsite sat approximately 100 yards from the road in a clearing surrounded by oak and pine. She set up her tent, arranged her sleeping bag, rated to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and organized her supplies. She prepared dinner around 6 p.m., and her campfire had burned to coals by 7 p.m. Around 8:30 p.m., Natalie left her tent to use the bathroom, walking approximately 50 feet into the woods with her headlamp. The forest floor was covered in fallen leaves and sloped gently downward. After finishing, she began walking back, but had turned roughly 90 degrees from her intended direction, without realizing it, moving deeper into the forest instead. After 2 minutes, she couldn't see her tent or the glow of the coals. Her headlamp went dark around 9:25 p.m., likely from depleted batteries weakened by the cold. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Based on the phone's screen activity logs, she used it briefly for light before shutting it off, consistent with conserving power. She continued moving in one direction, deeper into the forest, the terrain sloping steadily downward beneath her. Disoriented and moving in near-total darkness, she followed the slope downhill, likely searching for a trail or road. Within 20 minutes, she heard running water and moved toward it. The sound led her to a creek, roughly 12 feet wide, swollen and fast-moving from recent rainfall, with steep, muddy banks dropping sharply to the water. She followed the bank looking for a crossing. In the darkness, she misjudged the edge and dropped into the water before she could react. The creek was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold shock hit immediately, making effective swimming impossible. She was carried downstream and pushed against a partially submerged log approximately 80 yards down, but cold water incapacitation drained her grip within minutes. Her hands gave out. Rangers reached the Forest Service Road on November 10th after receiving a missing persons report. The campsite was completely undisturbed, tent zipped, sleeping bag laid out, winter coat folded inside, wallet and keys on her research notes. Investigators noted the campfire site was visible from about 80 feet away, directly behind the direction Natalie had walked away from. Search teams worked outward for 9 days through dense terrain. The heavily wooded ravine along the creek slowed ground teams significantly. Her headlamp was eventually recovered on the bank approximately 300 yards from the campsite at an area of disturbed mud marking where she had entered the water. Natalie was found on November 19th, 11 days after she went missing, caught against a debris pile nearly half a mile downstream. The medical examiner determined death resulted from drowning, with cold water incapacitation as the primary contributing factor. Time of death was estimated within 2 hours of her leaving the campsite. The case was ruled accidental. It was April 7th, 2018, in the abandoned mining district near Leadville, Colorado. The afternoon was sunny and cool with temperatures at 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Light winds blew from the west at 10 miles per hour. Snowmelt from the surrounding peaks had begun, creating small streams that ran down the hillsides. Julian Fuentes was 31 years old, a landscape photographer who specialized in abandoned industrial sites. He had been photographing old mines, ghost towns, and forgotten structures throughout Colorado for 3 years. Julian was in good health and had experience hiking in mountainous terrain. He drove to the area around 1 p.m., parking on a dirt road that accessed several abandoned mine sites. The area had been heavily mined for silver in the late 1800s, and dozens of old shafts and structures remained scattered across the mountainside, most unmarked and in various states of collapse. Julian wore hiking boots, jeans, and a light jacket, carrying his camera bag and a small backpack with water and snacks. He texted a friend at 1:15 p.m., saying he was exploring the mining area and planned to be home by evening. He spent about an hour photographing collapsed structures before hiking further up the slope around 2:30 p.m. At approximately 2:45 p.m., Julian was walking across what appeared to be flat ground covered with low brush, looking through his camera viewfinder to compose a shot. The ground beneath him was actually a layer of rotted wooden planks covered with decades of accumulated dirt and vegetation, placed over a vertical mine shaft in the early 1900s and never properly sealed. The wood gave way instantly. He dropped through the opening before he could react. The shaft was roughly 4 to 5 feet wide. Julian fell 35 feet, striking the rough rock walls several times before hitting a pile of loose rock and debris at the bottom. His right ankle twisted violently on impact, and his left wrist bent backward as he tried to break the fall. His head struck a rock, and his vision went white. When his senses returned, he was lying in complete darkness. He managed to sit up against the shaft wall despite the pain, His phone screen was cracked but functional. The flashlight revealed smooth rock walls with no handholds. The opening, a small circle of daylight 35 feet above. No signal showed on the screen. Every call and text attempt failed. The temperature at the bottom of the shaft was approximately 42 degrees Fahrenheit, reflecting the cold, stable environment of a deep shaft at Leadville's elevation. Julian was in only a light jacket. He called out for help every 15 to 20 minutes. No response came. As evening fell, the shaft turned completely black. He retrieved his backpack, which had landed nearby during the fall, and found 20 ounces of water and a few energy bars. He rationed carefully. Through the night of April 7th and into April 8th, he continued calling out and checking for signal. His ankle had swollen and turned dark purple. By the evening of April 8th, his phone battery was at 15%. Multiple call and text attempts failed. At 8:52 p.m., the battery died, leaving him in total darkness with no way to track time. By April 9th, his water was gone. Dehydration progressed rapidly. His lips cracked, his thinking grew sluggish, and his voice weakened to the point that calling out took significant effort. The cold continued draining him. He drifted in and out of consciousness over the following days, losing all sense of time in the absolute darkness. On approximately April 11th, Julian lost consciousness for the final time. His friend contacted authorities on April 8th after calls went unanswered. His SUV was found that evening, and a full search began April 9th. The terrain was difficult, with numerous shafts hidden beneath vegetation and debris. On April 18th, searchers found a partially collapsed opening with freshly broken boards at the edges. Julian's body was recovered from the bottom later that day. The medical examiner determined death was caused by hypothermia, with dehydration and injuries contributing to his decline. Time of death was estimated at April 11th, roughly 4 days after the fall. The shaft was later sealed with concrete and a steel grate. It was May 3rd, 2015, on a remote stretch of Lake Superior along the northern Great Lakes. The morning was calm, with light winds and cool spring temperatures around 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility stretched for miles under clear skies, and the lake surface remained relatively smooth with gentle swells. Jonas Hartwell was 34 years old, an experienced sailor who had navigated the Great Lakes for over a decade. He owned a 28-foot sailboat that he maintained meticulously. Jonas planned a solo 3-day sailing trip along the rugged shoreline, something he had done at least 15 times before. He was in good health and had passed a routine medical examination 2 months earlier. He departed from the marina at 7:15 a.m. with full provisions, safety equipment, and a working marine radio. His float plan indicated he would return by May 6th. Jonas told the harbor master he was looking forward to the solitude and planned to anchor in several secluded coves along the route. The forecast showed stable conditions for the next 72 hours. On the second day, May 4th, conditions remained favorable. Jonas was last seen by another boater around 2 p.m., approximately 8 miles offshore. He waved and appeared to be sailing normally. The other boater reported nothing unusual about his vessel or behavior. Sometime between May 4th at 2 p.m. and May 5th at dawn, Jonas slipped on the wet deck while adjusting rigging near the mast. His left shin struck a metal cleat with enough force to fracture the tibia, driving bone through a deep 4-inch laceration and leaving the wound exposed to contaminated water and debris across the deck. The wound bled heavily. Jonas made his way below deck, leaving a trail of blood across the cockpit and down the companionway stairs. Inside the cabin, he attempted to treat the injury himself. Medical supplies were found opened and scattered on the small table, showing he tried to clean and wrap the wound with bandages, antiseptic, and gauze. The marine radio remained mounted on the wall, fully functional, less than 6 feet from where he worked on his leg. Investigators later suggested the fall may have left him briefly unconscious or disoriented, delaying any attempt to transmit a distress call. His cell phone sat on the navigation table with no signal coverage. The emergency beacon stayed clipped in its holder near the companionway. Over the following days, investigators believe the untreated wound became severely infected. The boat drifted northeast, gradually moving farther from his intended route. Jonas's movements became limited to the cabin as the infection worsened. Water bottles were found empty near the sleeping berth, and food remained mostly untouched in the galley. By May 7th or 8th, the infection had spread extensively up his leg. Jonas had stopped moving entirely, remaining in the sleeping berth, unable to reach the radio or activate the emergency beacon. No distress calls were ever transmitted. Jonas was due back on May 6th. When he failed to arrive, the harbor master alerted the Coast Guard, and search aircraft and boats spent the next 5 days scanning his planned route. No radio transmissions, debris, or sightings were found, and the search was eventually suspended. Nearly 3 weeks later, on May 23rd, a commercial fishing crew spotted the sailboat drifting 31 miles from his planned route. The vessel appeared undamaged, and it was only after boarding that they realized what had happened. Forensic examination confirmed septic shock as the cause of death, the result of a severe bacterial infection introduced through the open fracture after the fall. Time of death was estimated at 10 to 14 days before discovery. Investigators formally noted the working radio and untouched emergency beacon in their final report. The death was ruled accidental. It was September 22, 2013, in the Cascade foothills east of Seattle, Washington. The morning was overcast with light drizzle and temperatures around 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The forecast called for intermittent rain throughout the day, with no severe weather expected. The forest floor was wet from overnight rain, and moss covered many of the rocks and fallen logs. Leonard Franklin was 52 years old, an amateur mycologist who spent most autumn weekends foraging for wild mushrooms. He had been collecting for over 15 years and was knowledgeable about identifying edible species. Leonard often explored new areas in the foothills, looking for productive spots away from other foragers. He was in good physical condition and experienced in navigating forest terrain. He parked at a trailhead around 9 a.m. and headed into the forest with a canvas bag, a field guide, a knife, and his phone. Leonard wore a rain jacket, jeans, and hiking boots. He told his wife he would be back by 3 p.m. and was heading to an area about 2 miles from the trailhead where chanterelles were reportedly abundant. The terrain was steep, covered with Douglas fir, cedar, and thick undergrowth of ferns and salal. Small ravines cut through the landscape, and the ground was uneven with exposed roots, rocks, and patches of slippery moss. Leonard followed an informal trail for about a mile before leaving the path to explore where mushrooms were more likely to grow. Around 11 a.m., he was moving laterally across a hillside when he spotted a cluster of golden chanterelles near the base of a large cedar tree about 20 feet downslope. He began descending carefully. On his third step, his boot landed on wet leaves, concealing a moss-covered rock, and slid forward instantly. Leonard fell backward and slid approximately 15 feet before his left leg struck a partially buried rock below the knee. The impact fractured his tibia. He came to rest in a small ravine, roughly 8 feet deep. His broken leg extended in front of him. His phone showed no signal. Surrounded by tall trees with no line of sight to any cell tower, every call attempt failed. He tried to stand using a sapling for support, but collapsed immediately when weight touched the broken leg. He could not climb the steep, wet ravine walls. He would have to wait. The drizzle continued. His jeans were soaked from the fall, and water was seeping through his jacket. He was already shivering by early afternoon. He tried his phone repeatedly for the next hour with no success, called out for help several times, and dragged himself 10 feet to a sheltered position beneath an overhanging rock face. The effort exhausted him. By 4 p.m., the battery showed 18%, and he turned the phone off to preserve it. Rain intensified through the evening. Temperatures dropped to 44 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Leonard drifted in and out of consciousness, waking from pain and cold. His phone died on September 23rd after a final failed attempt at signal. A small trickle of water ran through the bottom of the ravine, but in his deteriorating state and with the broken leg limiting movement, he was unable to collect enough to drink adequately. By September 24th, his shivering had stopped, a sign his core temperature had fallen dangerously low. He had not eaten since the morning of the 22nd. Late on September 24th, approximately 58 hours after the fall, his heart rate slowed to critical levels, and he lost consciousness for the final time. His wife contacted authorities the evening of September 22nd after driving to the trailhead and finding his truck still parked there. Search teams spent 3 days covering the difficult terrain before a search dog led handlers off trail on September 25th. Leonard's body was found in the ravine approximately 1.8 miles from the trailhead, his canvas bag with several chanterelles nearby. The medical examiner confirmed hypothermia as the cause of death, with the fractured tibia likely preventing any chance of self-rescue. Time of death was estimated at late evening on September 24th. Investigators determined the sequence of events to be consistent with an accident, and the case was closed. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.